know the vulnerability of race, what race means and racial politics mean in society, didn't do as well with the intervention, and that it helps to know, once you understand what it means to be black in the world, that that alerts you more to the issues of health. So knowing about race and the politics of racism can actually help one's health outcomes, because then you don't take for granted danger. You don't have to question it. Some things are dangerous that you need to know simply because you're black and male. And if you know that, you also can protect yourself from it. And that's where the health benefit of knowing about racism can come in handy. And both parents, men or women, who can teach their children about those politics can actually prepare them for that world.
Because you've also gone into schools after there have been, like, incidences, like racial incidences in the community and things of that nature. And I was just wondering what kind of activities you did when you would go into these schools after a racial incident happened, whether it's a racial incident on the campus of the school or racial incident in the community. Because I imagine there's been both cases, whether it's something that happened, like a Freddie Gray kind of situation, or something that happened like on the school grounds, which has happened on a regular basis throughout the country and everything. But I was just wondering how you cope with these kind of incidences and what kind of insights you brought in when you would go into these schools after these incidents.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, partly it so happened that we ended up in a Baltimore school, Catholic school, all-girls school, after Freddie Gray incident, which the girls were getting racial epithets because, again, the white students were watching the news and saw the students rioting in Baltimore and blamed it on the kids and not the situations. And they started taking it out on the black girls primarily from the Baltimore area. Just like the Chicago story, we go in and sometimes the issue is preparing the students for the racial insults of the environment. Another strategy, though, is understanding the story and the trauma of being different. And example is a school near here in which, cheerleaders and the football team go, and they were cheerleading, and during the game there was racial epithets, rock throwing, and in working with the cheerleaders, the message was when it got out in the news that it was other kids at the school, when they went to another school, that were making the racial insults. We ended up talking to the girls and finding out no one really asked them their entire story. And in the process, people didn't know that it really wasn't children that were making the racial epithets at the neighboring school. It was the adults. So another thing we will do is we'll go in and try to get the full story and help young people deal with the trauma of being racially aggressed. And so that is a skill. I think that's important for us to illuminate, that this isn't just a political nightmare. It's not just something that embarrasses schools, and it's really about how children's lives are at stake and their emotional lives are at stake.
You can imagine children have to cope with all kinds of things. It's not just our children, because I'm thinking about, like, even the gun incidents that have happened in different schools that have impacted all kinds of youth of all kinds of ethnicities, but, they were there in those environments when those things happened, whether it was Sandy Hooks or whether it was things like the church that happened in Charleston. And so a lot of times our youth hear about these things, and then they want to know, how it relates to their own lives and what they can do. And sometimes they seem to be it drives their own activism. I'm thinking about how a lot of, with all that's been going on with the gun things that have happened in our schools, we're seeing like a rise of activism that seems to be youth-driven. So I imagine that as some of these youth take leadership roles, people like you have to go in there and help these people understand some of the psychology of what they're getting into as they're taking a leadership role.
Yes, Yes. And, you know, adults are also traumatized by these events and not sure what to do. And you go, you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center has been looking since the election. There have been more hate crimes going on in ways that has happened around schools. So educators are stumbling too and traumatized. What do I do when religious and racial and a host of what you might call hate speech and hate crime is happening? So everybody needs support, not only the students, but the adults as well.
And so they definitely have to find ways to be able to cope with these things as they're taking place and learn their own coping strategies. I was also wondering, there was a book that came out, and we've actually talked about it on the show sometime back. I think it was on one of our other guests. And I was wondering if you think that is still relevant today, even though the book was written in the 70s. It was Michelle Wallace's book, The Myth of Superwoman and Black Macho. So the concept was that too many of our youth are being trained to be these type of macho.
You know what? You broke up there at the end.
Yeah, I was asking about Michelle Wallace's book, The Myth of Black Macho and the Superwoman, and I was just wondering if you find that is still a relevant book to this day and time, whether what she talked about is still relevant to the 21st century.
I do, absolutely. I mean, we're still defining both men, gender notions in very narrow ways. And so part of the issue, and I think it's a myth for every man and woman, regardless of the racial background, that, you know, if you believe, as is true in white supremacy, that you are superior to other people, the detriment is that not only is it a lie, but when you face the fact that it's a lie and you're not as superior and you're not as talented as everybody like you should be, there's a health risk to that lie. And so you can't meet up to that demand. And so, you know, the myth of being more human than everybody else is not only a lie, but it has health consequences. And it leads to you treating people as if they're not human. So I definitely agree with it. And part of it is we got to change our definitions of masculinity and our gender for boys and girls, and for those who are questioning.
Because that seems to be something else that seems to be going on this day, is because I was actually talking at one of my regular jobs and everything about that earlier today. It seems that right now we have a lot more terms of definitions of what people are, and that also seems to be adding a lot of psychological trauma. Our teenagers, when you've got everything from the stereotypical heterosexual male to the LGBT community to the cisgender and the different other terms that people are using and everything to define themselves, because I guess they don't want others to define them. They want to try to find ways to define themselves. So that seems to be adding a whole nother layer to some of the psychological things that are going on, because a lot of times people don't know how to identify with people unless they tell you how they want to be identified.
Yeah.
And that's even across the racial lines, because I'm thinking about how a lot of people will identify with one ethnic group, but then you have more and more people that are identifying among multiple ethnic groups. I mean, they are acknowledging the fact that they have more than one part of their ethnicity, and in some cases it may be 50-50. I can remember one of the films I just talked about that I saw last night. One of the youths was a Asian, Afro-Asian, I guess is what it would be considered, because her dad was African-American, her mother was definitely of Asian descent, and she identified with both parts of that culture. But then, you know, that was half and half, but then you have others that might have maybe 10% of their ethnicity is Native American, but they still want to claim that as part of their own identity, even though that's not the majority of their identity, because they may be majority African American with some white and 20% Indian, but they still want to acknowledge that part of their Native American background. So that seems to be, we seem to be seeing a rise of that, where people are identifying themselves in a variety of ways, both along sexual orientation as well as along racial lines.
Right. Part of it has come from a pain of having to squeeze people into narrow definitions of gender and finding that they don't always fit. And I think it also, as adults grow older, where there's less sort of social conformity pressures, they decide more clearly what they have been all along. And part of that pressure is a growing awakening of our difference. And I know it's troubling, but I think the pressure to be a certain kind of person in a particular model and stereotype has again, health consequences, and people are saying, why are we doing this to ourselves, to keep fitting people into these boxes that have, they represent problems for everybody, or more people than we thought.
Yeah, because one of the other incidences in the movie that I thought that was really interesting was there was a young, and I've seen this before, because, some ethnic groups look similar to each other if you look at their features and everything. So one gentleman was clearly Filipino, which is an Asian descent, but within the course of the interviews that they were doing, they asked him, well, what do people consider you? And he said, well, most people would think that I'm Hispanic. So, even though Filipinos are definitely part of the Asian culture and not part of the Hispanic culture, they do have some features that are similar to certain Asian cultures. So you can see where people might make that assumption and everything, but I guess that's one of them cases where people have to stand up and let folks know who they are and what they are right then and there, and kind of like have those moments that you were talking about, even with when people are calling you negative things like using the N-word, and you have to call them out. You might have to do the same thing with the ethnicities, and if you are identified with a certain ethnicity and they're not identifying you that way, then you need to let them know off the top of the, from Jump Street that, look, that's not who I am. My family is from the Philippines, and we moved here whenever, and share some of that history so that you're nipping it in the bud, and they're also learning a little bit about your culture.
Yes, absolutely. For students who've been biracial, we've learned too, it's important to learn to socialize around the history of your own cultures, both cultures, of understanding your history is important regardless of who you are. So, could there be a gap or a sense of missing emptiness if you don't explore all of the elements of your history? And I think we've used the African proverb for all of our work. The lion's story will never be known as long as the hunter is the one to tell it. And we're realizing just how many narratives we try to live up to that we never wrote, that our ancestors never wrote for us. They didn't have this destiny for us. And so part of that is, tracking and telling your own story.
Right, and that's what the more of us seem to need to do, is to tell our own story. We can't all believe that everybody that's from the trying to think of one, that everybody that's from the Philippines looks like one of those Hawaiians from Hawaii 5-0 and everything, and the same thing that not everybody that's Native American looks like Tonto, because there were various tribes that were out there, and they all had different kinds of features and different kinds of lifestyles. Some were a little bit more warrior class, and some might have been a little bit more farmer kind of class. So there was different things going on depending on which part of the country they were in and what they were trying to cope with in those environments. Some might have been in a more mountainous kind of environment, so they were fighting one thing, whereas somebody in North Carolina or New York would be fighting something totally different.
Right. Yeah.
We have to understand and look at these histories, but too often I think also that we let the media put the stereotypes in, and I'm not just thinking about the commercial media, meaning what we see on TV and films, but also I'm sure that